This is the Sleepless Historian, weaving history's whispers for restless nights. Join our journey at Historica, share the calm, subscribe, and drift deeper into the past. The cuneiform writing system is among the most important cultural contributions of Mesopotamian society. The number of cuneiform documents surviving from the early dynastic period, the time of the earliest city-states from around 2900 to 2350 BCE, is relatively small. More survive from the time of the Akkadian Empire and the second dynasty of Lagash, which followed. But when we come to the next major era of Mesopotamian history, the documentation positively explodes. This was a period when Mesopotamia was dominated by a dynasty that ruled from the city of Ur in the southern part of modern-day Iraq. It's known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, the Ur III period for short, and it lasted a little more than a century, from around 2112 to 2004 BCE. Not many of these cuneiform texts record poems or hymns or myths. Instead, most are administrative. A huge number of them come from the Ur III period, and studied as a large group, these documents reveal amazing details about the economy and administration of the era. In fact, more than 120,000 cuneiform tablets written during the time are estimated to have been found so far, and they're housed all over the place. One study discovered that 545 different collections, museums, and libraries around the world have tablets from the Ur III period. A lot of them was sold on the antiquities market over the past 150 years or so. I learned to read the ancient languages in graduate school, and I used cuneiform in my research. Several times during my career, I've been asked by a curator of a small museum or by a librarian if I'd look at a cuneiform tablet in their collection to see what it says. In just about every case, the tablet turns out to be from the Ur III period. Unlike almost all of these tablets, it records some commodities received by a temple or palace, or delivered to an individual or an institution, or it records payments made to workers. The tablets were drawn up every day, apparently in every palace and temple and government office in the Ur III kingdom, and they listed the receipt and distribution of individual items. Where did the goods come from? Where were they going to be sent? Who were they being given to? What was the date when this happened? Who oversaw it? All this information was meticulously recorded on small tablets that were stored together. Here's a typical example of a transaction. It uses the standard measurements of the time: barig, ban, and sila. 2 barig, 2 ban, 2 sila of clarified butter, 3 barig of cheese, deficit of the herdsman or kanara. After the individual transaction records were created, the information was combined into big ledgers. This usually happened once a month. None of these tablets was intended to survive. The scribes didn't write them thinking about how people in the future might view them. They were purely functional, yet they did survive. It's as though a bunch of individual W-2 forms in an accountant's office were to survive for 4,000 years, and future historians tried to reconstruct the modern world based on those forms. You can imagine the kinds of things they would observe. So, this person was paid some amount for working at a particular company. This other person was paid more. This is how much they paid in taxes. This is who oversaw their work. A future historian would have lots of questions. What lies behind those names? What were their working conditions? What did they care about? There's so much missing. That's true for the Ur III texts as well. What we do know is that thousands and thousands of men and women worked for different aspects of the central and provincial administrations in some way or another. They worked in the military, or as builders, farmers, herdsmen, religious functionaries, officials, scribes, artisans, or servants. Each province in the kingdom paid taxes to the central government, but the provinces didn't all owe their taxes on the same day. In Mesopotamia, there was no equivalent of the April 15th deadline. Instead, Each province was responsible for paying during a particular month. These taxes supported the government for that month. In the next month, it was the turn of another province. This meant that wealth was coming in year-round. Taxes were paid in goods, not in silver. So the administration built a whole town to cope with the goods coming in and the goods going out. It was called Puzrish Dagon and was close to the religious capital city of Nippur. A huge number of tablets survived from the main offices there. Boats were constantly being unloaded, herds of animals shepherded around, granaries were being filled and emptied. Every item that arrived or left Puzrish Dagon was recorded, and these records were filed and later compiled. Scholars used to think the Ur-3 period was a time of tyrannical kings who controlled every aspect of the economy. They reasoned that if every single goat and cow had to be accounted for among the huge herds of animals that passed through Puzrish Dagon and every other town, then some megalomaniac, a very successful megalomaniac, must have been behind this process. But contemporary scholars have revised this view. Although the Third Dynasty of Ur was a time when a lot of changes took place, the kings didn't rule with an iron hand. They had to work within an existing system that included powerful temples and governors with whom the king's administration negotiated. The first king of the Ur-3 dynasty was named Ur-Nama. He and his son Shulgi built an empire. It was the first one since the Akkadian Empire, which had been built by King Sargon in the 24th century BCE. Ur-Nama and Shulgi took over much of southern and central Mesopotamia and extended the borders of their land to the region around the ancient city of Susa in what is now western Iran. But scholars disagree about how successful the Ur-3 dynasty rulers were in controlling their empire. Shulgi certainly spent a lot of time on campaign during his reign, but not necessarily conquering new lands. He might have been trying to retain control of existing domains, but constantly trying to leave the empire. Mesopotamia wasn't easily unified, and each aspiring emperor had difficulties in maintaining control of the lands he conquered. Ur-3 kings didn't boast about territorial conquests, and in this they were nothing like King Sargon. Instead, the Ur-3 kings claimed that they liberated the lands they took over. They adopted a tone in their inscriptions that was more like some of the kings of Lagash from the early dynastic period, or like the more recent king Gudea, who ruled Lagash from around 2144 to 2124 BCE. The ruler's main goal, they said, was to protect the weak people in society from strong individuals and institutions that might exploit them or hurt them. So the kings didn't want to be seen as fierce tyrants. They were kind shepherds. They promoted this image by creating a new kind of royal inscription that was probably displayed in public. It's usually called a law code in history books, but it wasn't called a law code when it was first created. It started with a prologue, all about King Ur-Nama and his great achievements. The statement ended this way: I did not deliver the orphan to the rich. I did not deliver the widow to the mighty. I did not deliver the man with but 1 shekel to the man with 1 mina, that is 60 shekels. I eliminated enmity, violence, and cries for justice. I established justice in the land. Well, what the king emphasized here was how good he was to his people. Then he added a new type of statement to the inscription. Immediately after the prologue he wrote, At that time, if a man commits a homicide, they shall kill that man. And a few lines later, if a man divorces his first-ranking wife, he shall weigh and deliver 60 shekels of silver. These obviously are laws. They're phrased in the same way as most of the laws in the Bible. If someone does a particular thing, then this or that punishment or fine will be imposed. But when Ur-Nama's inscription was written, it might not have been obvious that the statements constituted laws. They seem instead to have been listed as concrete examples of how Ornama was going to protect his people and establish justice. There's nothing in the inscription to say the rules had to be followed by judges in court. Today, Ornama is often considered to be the man who invented laws. But these laws don't ever seem to have been copied individually in ancient times, and they didn't ever appear without the prologue. So the inscription seems to have been thought of as a whole unit, not as a collection of laws that could be quoted and analyzed separately. The laws were part of the king's proclamation as to how he would rule and why his subjects should trust him. They weren't used like a modern law code at all. The king needed his people's support, and they benefited from the order he brought to their lives, as reflected in these clauses. Rather than being rules to be enforced, they were probably legal precedents based on past court cases. The courts had already existed for centuries before this proclamation and functioned well without the need for written laws. And so, rather than directly consult the king's decrees, the judges continued to decide cases based on the evidence and on past precedents. The Ur-3 kings also tried other new things to claim their legitimate right to rule, without terrorizing the population as the Akkadian kings had done. It's during this period that a compilation of the names of kings and the cities they've ruled, going back to the beginning of civilization, seems to have been written. This is the Sumerian king list. But it isn't historically accurate. It presents an idealized past in which Mesopotamia was always unified, with kingship over the land passing smoothly from one city to another, and with each in turn becoming capital of the whole land. This wasn't true, of course. For most of history, the land had been divided into small kingdoms and city-states that warred with one another. Still, the ideal of unity was useful. If people believed it was normal for all of Mesopotamia to be ruled by one dynasty, then they'd be less likely to rebel against the Ur-3 kings who really had unified the land under their rule. Ornama boasts in the prologue to his laws that he standardized weights and measures. This was another way to promote order and unity across the land, and to make sure the kingdom ran smoothly. At the time, it seems, all the Mesopotamian cities already used shekels and minas to weigh things. There were 60 shekels in a mina, and a mina weighed about 1 pound. But the minas weren't uniform. A mina in one city might weigh slightly more than a mina in another city. The temples kept standard sets of weights and measures, but until this time they had applied to only one particular region. You can see why Ornama and Shulgi would want the same standards to apply everywhere. If people were paying taxes, and they had different conceptions of what, say, a mina or a shekel was, or what constituted a bushel of barley, then what arrived at the palace as payment might be less than expected. Trade would also be easier if everyone had the same set of weights and measures. You wouldn't need to keep converting from one standard to another. The kings also attempted to create a single calendar to be used everywhere in the kingdom. At that time, years weren't numbered. Instead, each year was named for a significant achievement by the king. Since many documents were dated, the year names provided the subjects with a constant reminder of the king's greatness. Some year names referred to a king's pious works for the gods, like appointing priests or priestesses, or restoring temples. Other year names mentioned marriages between the king's daughters and other rulers, and there were year names about building city walls. But a lot of them were about conquests of cities. They show that the Ur-3 kings were more warlike than their other inscriptions would have us believe. In their drive to standardize things, the central administration even seems to have unified building techniques. There were standardized types and sizes of bricks, and innovations in the construction of public buildings. The builders started baking bricks for the exterior walls instead of just drying them in the sun, and they added strategic holes in the structures to allow the interior bricks which was sun-dried, to continue to dry out even after the building was constructed. The kings sponsored the construction of huge pyramid-shaped temple towers in many of the cities. These were called ziggurats, and they were constructed next to the great temples of the gods. Each ziggurat was a solid mass of brick built in 4 or 5 giant steps, probably with a small shrine on the top. They were built on a scale that had never been seen before in Mesopotamia. The ziggurat at the capital city of Ur was particularly magnificent. It was maybe 100 feet tall, and its base measured 210 feet by 148 feet. The lower level was reconstructed recently in the 20th century, and it gives you a sense of the huge scale of the operation. It's been estimated that 1,000 men would have to have worked for almost 5 months straight to deliver and place the bricks for just the first stage of the Ur ziggurat. These hundreds of builders were supported by brickmakers, rope makers, cooks, water carriers, physicians, a whole community, and all of these people had to be fed and housed by the administration. It was a colossal undertaking. The ziggurats going up all over the kingdom must have made a huge impression on the people. The landscape in southern Mesopotamia is absolutely flat. Only the occupation mounds where the cities were located would have risen above the flat plain. You'd have seen them from far away as you walked along the roads or sailed on the rivers or canals. The cities would stand out on the horizon. And now, these big stepped temple towers rose up in the center like artificial mountains, testifying to the power of the king, and proving his love for the gods, and showing off the organization of his administration. The kings also commissioned royal tombs near the temples. These were dug underground, with steps leading down into the rooms with vaulted ceilings. Unfortunately, the tombs were robbed long ago, but archaeologists have found the remains of gold leaf, lapis lazuli, and agate. These remnants reveal that the walls would have been covered with gold and semi-precious stones, and the ceilings were painted with stars. The tombs would have been spectacular houses for the kings to live in after death. In trying to convince the population to support them, the Ur III kings reinstituted an idea that had begun with Sargon's grandson, King Naram-Sin of Akkad. Starting with King Shogi, rulers had scribes write a divine symbol in front of their names because they wanted to be viewed as gods. They even claimed to have superhuman powers. Shogi had a hymn composed in his honor that is sometimes called the King of the Road. In it, he mentions 2 festivals that took place on the same day, one in the city of Ur and the other in Nippur. The divine king decided to celebrate both by running from one city to the other and back in a single day. This was a distance of 100 miles, that's 200 miles round trip, so the feat simply was not possible. Besides which, King Shogi described a huge hailstorm that blew in as he ran. Being divine, of course, he claimed that he achieved his goal and made it to Nippur and back, celebrating both festivals on the same day with no problem. Scribes studied and copied this hymn in school, along with others like it. 48 such royal poems have been found, all extolling the greatness of the Ur III kings. The kings also wanted to show how pious they were, and that they were loved and chosen by the gods. A new image that shows up on steles and cylinder seals at this time is known as the presentation scene. In it, a god or goddess is seated on a throne, with the king standing in front, and another minor goddess leading him or standing behind him. The king is shown praying to the god, or pouring a libation to the deity. Sometimes the god is depicted handing a rod and a ring to the king. These were the symbols of authority and power. Even though the Ur III kings were supposed to be divine, they still had to work with all the other parts of government and society to make things run smoothly. They didn't simply proclaim things and assume they would be done. Mesopotamia didn't work that way. You can think of Mesopotamia at this time as a conglomeration of households. At the family level, the household is easy to conceive of. A typical Mesopotamian household consisted of a married couple and their children living together. With them were elderly relatives, along with unmarried aunts and maybe some servants. The oldest male relative, the grandfather or father of the family, was head of the household. But the house was an economic unit, not just a social one. If the family owned fields or animals, then those provided food. If the family was involved in some other profession, as artisans or scribes or merchants, then the work was often performed in the home. Even officials who worked for the court seem to have done at least some of their work at home rather than in an office at the palace. The term for house in Sumerian is A, so each house was thought of as the A of the patriarch. Every temple was also an A. These temples all had names and each started with the word house. So, the temple of the moon god at Ur was the Agishurgal, the house of the great light. The temple of the great god Enlil at Nippur was the Akor, or mountain house. The temple of the goddess Inanna at Uruk was the Eanna, or house of heaven. And the temples weren't only houses for the gods, they also had households with dependents and land and herds of animals. These could represent immense resources. The head of the temple household was the high priest or priestess. Some religious leaders were appointed by the king, but not all. So the king had to negotiate with the temple households, which controlled a great deal of the wealth of the kingdom. Governors of provinces were also patriarchs of their own households, their palaces and the estates. The word for palace in Sumerian was gal, great house. A governor had considerable autonomy in ruling his province and was perceived as the father of his giant household. We see this, for example, in texts from the city of Umma, which had been a long-time rival of the city of Lagash in previous centuries. About 15,000 cuneiform tablets from the Ur-3 period were found in Umma, and the majority of them record the administrative dealings of the governor's household. Scholars learn from examining these tablets that the governor had authority over almost everything in his province, including the temple. He also controlled a lot of offices that oversaw almost all aspects of the economy. He administered offices for specific products such as leather, wool, animals, and grain. And there were offices of agriculture, boats, and labor. A fiscal office coordinated it all, keeping track of taxes and payments. It was a very orderly system. Imagine dozens of officials and scribes employed in a hierarchical system, paying attention to all the food produced, all the objects manufactured, all the people employed, all the boats commissioned, all the buildings constructed, and recording it meticulously so nothing got lost, no payment was missed. Although the great kings of the Ur-3 dynasty ruled over Umma and received taxes from the province, their names aren't mentioned much in the documents found there. One of the only places the names of the kings show up is in the dates on the texts, because the years were named for the king's great achievements. The kings also controlled the military, but even the soldiers were overseen by local generals from Umma. So the evidence from Umma has shown that the kingdom of the third dynasty of Ur was nothing like as centralized as scholars used to think. The provinces paid their taxes to the king, but they had a lot of autonomy. Holding a lot of this economy together in an interesting way was a group of merchants. At Umma, there were at least 20 of them during the Ur-3 period. They worked directly for the governor's administration. Some of what they did is pretty much what you would expect of a merchant. They traveled and acquired valuable goods in distant lands and brought them back to Umma. But they also had other important responsibilities. One is that they seem to have been in charge of collecting and processing fruits, vegetables, and fish for the governor. In the hot climate of southern Mesopotamia, without refrigeration, these foodstuffs would have gone bad very quickly. It seems that merchants were particularly adept at getting perishables from the farm or the river to the consumer as fast as possible. The merchants were also willing to make loans to private individuals. Banking hadn't been invented, but people sometimes needed to borrow grain to sow their crops, or to borrow silver to buy something. merchants had extra grain and silver on hand and could fill this need. One merchant who lived in Ur towards the end of the Ur III period was named Lu Enlila. He was employed by the Temple of the Moon God and regularly traveled by boat all the way to Magan, which is now Oman, to buy copper. This was a well-established trade route, and he took wool and textiles to pay for the metal. Mesopotamian kingdoms had been getting copper from Oman for a long time. But in the Ur III period, a merchant like Lu Enlila worked directly for the temple, one of those great households. The land of Magan might also have been a diplomatic partner of the kings of Ur. Until the Ur III period, the exchange of envoys and peace treaties, dynastic marriages and diplomatic correspondence seemed to have taken place only among states within Mesopotamia and Syria. But King Shogi received a gift of gold's dust from the king of Magan, according to an administrative text. Luxury gifts were often a sign of diplomacy. Another clue is found in a slightly later text mentioning the arrival of someone named Wedum, who is described as the courier of the governor of Magan. So perhaps the king of Magan sent envoys regularly to Ur with expensive gifts, and perhaps even letters. The Ur kings had close contacts with the lands to the east of Mesopotamia. They directly controlled the city of Susa and had diplomatic ties with other population centers in the same general area of Elam in southwestern Iran. The names of Elamite envoys show up in the administrative texts. They received gifts and attended important festivals. Also, princesses from Ur were sent to marry Elamite kings to cement the alliances. As you can imagine, the city of Ur must have been a pretty cosmopolitan place. Envoys, merchants, and other visitors from distant lands were not an uncommon sight on the streets. In one text, it sounds as though there might even have been South Asians who lived together and worked alongside native Mesopotamians. They are described as men from a Maluha village. Maluha was the Indus Valley. So in addition to hearing Elamite spoken as you walked around Ur, you would probably also hear the languages of Margan and Maluha, along with the local languages of Sumerian and Akkadian. And there probably would have been another language heard on the streets, Amorite. It was spoken by people from lands to the west and north. Throughout the Ur III period, immigrants from this region settled in Mesopotamia. They were referred to as the Martu or Westerners, or as the Tidnum, and their language was Semitic, similar to Akkadian, but also closely related to later West Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew. So the Ur III kings tried a different approach to running their empire that had been seen before. The extended household economy flourished and was well organized and effective. In addition, the Ur III rulers created something of a cult of the kings. They emphasized their greatness and encouraged people to believe that the kings were on their side. Even in modern times, there's been a tendency to see Shogi as one of the great kings of Mesopotamian history. But, as it turned out, the empire lasted for little more than a century, and the Ur III kings might have achieved less than they would have had us believe, because in the end, they had trouble holding on to their empire. Mesopotamia was a place where people spoke many languages. It started with Sumerian, which was dominant in the south, and Akkadian, which was spoken more often in the center and north. The early people of Ebla in Syria spoke a language that we refer to as Eblaite, and there was also a large population of people in northern Syria who spoke a language called Hurrian. Akkadian and Eblaite were Semitic languages, but Sumerian and Hurrian were unrelated to Semitic and unrelated to one another. Then, down from the Zagros Mountains, came the Gutians, who invaded at the end of the Akkadian Empire and spoke yet another language, as did the Elamites, who lived in what is now Iran to the east. Almost all of these people adopted cuneiform as their writing system. This was a wedge-shaped script, usually written on clay tablets. They mostly expressed themselves in the dominant languages of Sumerian and Akkadian, though they also sometimes wrote texts in their own languages. It seems that the curriculum in scribal schools was similar everywhere, and very traditional, though scribes continued to learn Sumerian long after it was no longer spoken much at all. Cuneiform represented sounds and whole words, so it could be used, in theory anyway, to record just about any language. The fact that scribes who spoke other languages tended to write in Akkadian or Sumerian is probably because of their training, in the same way that monks of the medieval period wrote in Latin even if they didn't speak it much. Also, there were challenges to writing down some languages in cuneiform. For example, some sounds aren't represented because they don't seem to have occurred in Akkadian, like the sounds of the letters O, F, J, and V. I sometimes teach the basics of cuneiform to middle school kids. I might have them try to write their names using the cuneiform script. Boys named Joseph face a challenge since 3 of the sounds in their names can't be written. The speakers of some ancient languages probably had similar difficulties when writing in cuneiform if they had different sounds in their words. Just like when we try to write Chinese or Arabic words using the alphabet that we inherited from the Romans, they must have made compromises. Anyway, the point of this is that Mesopotamia was a big melting pot of people who came from different parts of the Near East and spoke different languages. Mesopotamia was a river valley with few natural boundaries, such as mountain ranges or coastlines, so it was always open to people migrating from other places. It had also always been very open to trade. There must have been tons of official translators and plenty of people who were bilingual as well. Sometimes, when a new group showed up speaking an unknown language, they were viewed with suspicion at first, like the Gutians, who were even described in literary works as not quite human, but they almost always ended up settling down and becoming part of the culture, and often they took leading roles and headed new dynasties. Quite quickly, they stopped being viewed as foreigners and became part of the community. One of these new groups started showing up during the Ur-3 period in the late 3rd millennium BCE, and by the end of that dynasty, the kings of Ur seem to have been increasingly worried about them. The new arrivals were called the Amorites. A high official wrote to one of the last Ur-3 kings, named Shu-Sin, that the Amorites have repeatedly raided the territory in the north. He reminded the king of what he had been instructed to do. You ordered me to rebuild the fortification, cut off their infiltration route to prevent them from swooping down on the fields for a breach in the defenses between the Tigris and Euphrates. King Shu-Sin did build a wall to keep the Amorites out, just as the official described. He named a year after this achievement. The wall might have been erected at the point where the Tigris and Euphrates flow closest together. But it doesn't seem to have been successful. Immigrants continued to move into Mesopotamia from different regions. The last king of the dynasty, Ibbi-Sin, commemorated a military victory over the Amorites in one of his year names. He called it the year the Amorites, the powerful south wind, who from remote past have not known cities, submitted to Ibbi-Sin, the king of Ur. So, who were the Amorites? A myth described them as being completely uncivilized. The Amorites who know no grain, no house nor town, the boors of the mountains. The Amorite who digs up truffles, who does not bend his knees to cultivate the land, who eats raw meat, who has no house during his lifetime, who is not buried after his death. As you can tell from this description, the Mesopotamians believed that the Amorites had started out as nomads rather than farmers, traveling seasonally with their sheep and goats. Scholars thought for some time that the conflict in the late Ur-3 period was a result of these nomadic Amorites wanting to settle in the agricultural lands of Mesopotamia. But this doesn't seem to have any basis in fact. There were some Amorites who were nomads, but there were others who seemed to have always lived in cities. The name Amorite just means people from the west. Their language also shows they were Western. Amorite was a West Semitic language, not East Semitic like Akkadian. Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic are also West Semitic languages, though those came later. Weirdly, the Amorites didn't write their language down much. Even though Amorite scribes learned to read and write, they always wrote in Akkadian and Sumerian. The way we know something about the grammar and vocabulary of their language is from their personal names. The names give us a sense of how Amorite was spoken, because everyone's name was a phrase. These were often about the gods, so someone's name might be beloved of the god Dargon, or gift of the goddess Ninkarak. Amorite parents tended to give their children names that made sense in their own language. The Amorites were blamed by some later Mesopotamians for the end of the Ur-3 kingdom, but the real situation was much more complex. Even before any invasions, there was a famine that severely affected the kingdom. A later poem lamenting the fate of Ur put it this way: Enlil installed a pestilent famine in the city. He installed a city destroyer and a temple destroyer in the city. There was no beer in the brewery, there was no malt, there was no food for him, that's the king, in his palace. No grain filled his magnificent storehouse. He could not bear his life. Inflation seems to have skyrocketed, and people were desperate for food. A high official named Ishbi-Era took advantage of the weakness of Ebi-Sin, the last Ur king. This official, Ishbi-Era, stopped working for the king and set himself up as an independent leader in the southern city of Isin. Someone wrote about this to King Ebi-Sin, and we actually have this letter. It tells the king that the renegade official Ishbi-Era believed he had been promised the kingship over the land by the god Enlil, and the god had also promised to remove King Ebi-Sin from power. The letter goes on to say, "It was just as he, Ishbi-Era, said. He captured Nippur. The land trembles like a reed fence from his clamor. Ishbi-Era goes everywhere at the head of his troops." You can imagine how unnerving this must have been for King Ebi-Sin. All the signs suggested the gods were against him. The famine, Ishbi-Era's success in breaking away and making his own little kingdom out of part of the kingdom of Ur. And then there were the increasing numbers of Amorites settling throughout the kingdom. And then around 2004 BCE, Ur was invaded, but not by the Amorites. Instead, the attack came from Elam to the east. First, the Elamites took over the city of Susa. This was an economic blow to the Ur-3 kingdom, since Susa and the lands in that eastern region were rich and important to the trade routes that flourished there. But even by then, the Ur-3 kings had already overextended themselves, and they'd broken important diplomatic ties. A few years later, the Elamites destroyed the capital of Ur and took poor Ebi-Sin as a hostage back to Elam. For a few years, the Elamites ruled Ur, but they were forced out in the end by Ishbi-Era, that former official who had set up his own kingdom in Isin, and who was so convinced that Enlil had wanted him to reign. So Ishbi-Era did found his own dynasty in Isin, but he didn't control all of the territory that had been subject to the Ur-3 kings. Instead, it splintered into a number of smaller kingdoms. In some ways, the beneficiaries of the dissolution of the Ur-3 kingdom ended up being the Amorites, even though they weren't the ones who had caused it. The 2 centuries that followed the end of the third dynasty of Ur were full of wars. The new kingdoms each had a king who ruled from a major city, and who was supported by a number of vassal kings in smaller cities. Their armies fought one another frequently. The various kings made alliances, broke them, and made new alliances, only to break these too. Some of their vassals also switched sides on a regular basis, so some of the warfare was directed at bringing vassal kingdoms back into the fold. There's a well-known letter written around this time that sums up the situation. The letter was written by an official to the king of Mari, which was a kingdom along the Euphrates in eastern Syria. The official said, "There is no king who is strong on his own. Hammurabi of Babylon has a following of 10 or 15 kings. Rimsin of Larsa, the same. Ibal-Piel of Eshnuna, the same. Amut-Piel of Katna, the same. And Yarim-Lim of Yamhud has a following of 20 kings. And to that, the 10 or 15 kings who followed the king of Mari. And that's between 70 and 100 rulers in Mesopotamia during this time. Some of the vassal kings had very small domains, but each had sworn a treaty with his overlord, one of the 6 or 7 major kings, and sent troops to support his overlord in times of war, and paid taxes as well. I'll spare you the details of the many wars that were fought, but during these turbulent times, people seem to have looked back on the Third Dynasty of Ur as a long-lost period of peace and comfort. Lamentations were written about the destruction of the great cities of Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and Eridu that had happened at the end of the Ur III period. In these lamentations, the destruction wasn't blamed on the Elamite invaders. Instead, the people, as always, blamed the gods, and thought that the invaders had simply been carrying out the will of the gods. They even thought that the city god of Ur, the moon god Nana, was responsible for the destruction. Nana had abandoned his people, and that was why the Elamites had been successful. A lamentation about the destruction of Ur put it this way: rebellion fell upon the land, something which no one had known. It was something which had not been seen, something unspeakable, something that could not be grasped. All the lands were confounded in their fear. The gods of the city turned away. The shepherd fell away. Population breathed in fear. Right after the Ur III dynasty, the people might have thought that their civilization was coming to an end. Things must have been desperate. Maybe they told stories about the greatness of Ur-Nama and Shulgi, and before them Sargon and Naram-Sin, and before them the mythical early dynastic king Gilgamesh, who perhaps lived around 2500 BCE. His reign was as far in the past to the people of 2000 BCE as Shakespeare and Elizabeth I are to us today. But we have the benefit of hindsight, and we know this wasn't an end at all. It was the prelude to a time of prosperity and renewed vitality, known as the Old Babylonian period. During the era of widespread warfare that followed the Ur III period, many cities had new kings on the throne, kings who founded new dynasties, and many of these dynasties were of Amorite descent. These Amorite kings were especially common in the center and northwest of Mesopotamia. One Amorite dynasty began to rule the previously unimportant city of Babylon, and successfully passed the throne from father to son for centuries. Among the kings of Babylon was the famous Hammurabi, who ruled from about 1792 to 1750 BCE. Other important kingdoms of the era were those mentioned in that letter I quoted a moment ago: Katna and Yamhud in the west, Mari in the northwest, Ekalatum in the northeast, Eshnuna in the east, and Isin and Larsa to the south of Babylon. These 8 kingdoms were the squabbling successors to the Third Dynasty of Ur. Yamhud was the biggest of them. Its capital city was in Aleppo, in the north of Syria near Turkey. Unfortunately, we don't know much about Yamhud because the archives of the royal court have never been discovered. They must be somewhere deep under modern Aleppo. Perhaps they'll never be recovered. Aleppo has been continuously occupied since ancient times, so the old Babylonian remains lie under the debris of all the intervening periods: the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, Hellenistic Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire, the early Islamic period, and on, right up to the present day. It's an odd fact, actually, that the sites best known for their archaeological finds weren't necessarily all that important in ancient times. And the cities that were really important sometimes haven't even been found yet, like Agade, the ancient capital of the Akkadian Empire. Or they're hidden under vast amounts of later remains, like Aleppo. The way we tell the history of the Old Babylonian period would probably be very different if we had more details about the kings of Yamhud and their administrations in Aleppo. All we know is the names of the kings, and a little bit about their political history. On the other hand, we have a great deal of information about some Mesopotamian people from this era who weren't kings at all. One striking thing about the early 2nd millennium BCE is that a lot more documents have been found in ancient private houses. For eras before the Old Babylonian period, most of the documents were found in public buildings, such as palaces and temples. The tablets from private houses show us that people were able to run their own businesses and own their own houses and fields, much more than had been true in earlier periods. It seems also that a lot more people were able to read and maybe to write as well. It would still have been a very small percentage of the population, but these literate people didn't all work for the big institutions anymore, like the palace and the temple. One group of people who could read and write, and who were entrepreneurial, and who got rich, were merchants. And one group of Mesopotamian merchants has left us an amazing record of their lives and their businesses. Weirdly enough, their records weren't found in Mesopotamia. They were found in Turkey. In the early 20th century, a number of cuneiform tablets began appearing on the worldwide antiquities market. They included letters that had clearly been written by merchants, and they were said to have been found in Turkey, at the site of an ancient city called Kanesh. Turkish archaeologists went to dig there, beginning in 1948, but their excavations uncovered no cuneiform tablets at all. Finally, a villager gave away the secret. The tablets that other villagers had found and sold hadn't come from the mound at all, but from a particular place in the fields nearby. The excavators turned their attention there. This area turned out to be a sort of suburb of the main city, a neighborhood of private houses. Its inhabitants called it the Karum. Karum usually meant harbor in Akkadian, but there was no river or waterway of any sort there. Harbors were centers for trade, and that was the meaning of Karum in this case. It was the place where merchants gathered and found customers. The surprising thing about these merchants of Kanesh is that they weren't local to the area. They were from the city of Ashur, which is more than 800 miles away to the east on the Tigris River in northern Mesopotamia. So what were they doing there? Their tablets reflect the earliest known use of the cuneiform script in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, but the Anatolians hadn't adopted it yet. The Assyrian merchants brought with them their habit of keeping records on clay tablets, right along with the goods they carried to trade. Many houses in the Karum belonged to these Assyrian traders, and they kept their records stored in the houses, sometimes hundreds of documents in a single residence. For example, one house excavated in 1993 contained 178 letters, 69 loan contracts, 38 records of legal proceedings, and 102 personal accounts. In total, 17,700 tablets have come out of the excavations, when almost 5,000 more came from the site before the excavation started. These tablets give us a vivid picture of what life was like for an Assyrian merchant in the 20th and 19th centuries BCE. Unlike merchants of earlier times, these men weren't representing a temple or a king or any other major institution. The government of Ashur hadn't sent them, and the king seemed to have almost no control over them. Instead, the traders were organized as families, and these merchant families acted pretty much on their own. The merchants even drew up a treaty with the king of Kanesh, a treaty that protected both parties and facilitated trade between them. This is a remarkable document. Most treaties were between two kings, and in this case, the Assyrian merchants represented themselves. The king of Ashur wasn't involved. The merchants were insured against theft. The king of Kanesh pledged to replace stolen goods if the thief couldn't be found, but only if the merchant was willing to swear an oath that he'd been robbed. The king of Kanesh had to swear that he wouldn't try to take their goods, or to force them to sell the goods cheaply to him. On the other hand, the merchants pledged to pay taxes to him, 1/10 of what they were selling. It seems to have been a good arrangement, and they all benefited. The Assyrians lived among the Anatolians with the blessing and support of the local king, and no violence seems to have been involved in the Assyrians' occupation in Kanesh. The Assyrians didn't have to invade. They had goods for sale that the Anatolians really wanted, so they were welcome. The most desirable items they sold were tin and textiles. In exchange, the Anatolians had a ready supply of silver, which the Assyrians needed, because it had become the medium of exchange throughout Mesopotamia, and because there were no known mineral resources or metal ores in Mesopotamia at the time. So this was how it worked. An Assyrian merchant family gathered together a shipment of textiles and tin in the city of Ashur. The textiles were not just everyday plain fabrics. They had to be particularly finely made, often by Babylonian women from south of Assyria, whose weaving was thought to be especially good. Plenty of letters exist documenting the efforts of merchants to find the very best textiles to take with them. The Assyrians paid the weavers for these textiles, though they paid much less, of course, than the goods were sold for. Some of them were made in the region of Ashur, but these weren't valued as much as the ones from areas of Mesopotamia further to the south. Of course, almost everyone in the Near East had access to wool, but not everyone had the same level of skill in spinning, dyeing, and weaving. The Mesopotamian weavers did something extraordinary, maybe with colored designs or embroidery or the fineness of the weave. Whatever their particular specialty was, it made their textiles incredibly sought after. Unfortunately, none of the textiles have survived, so we can't examine them to see what was so remarkable about them. But if you think about the value and quality of Persian carpets or Chinese silks or Navajo rugs in later times, you can get a sense of why the Anatolians wanted to buy them. The Assyrian merchants also bought tin from the mountain areas to the east and shipped it on to Anatolia. Tin was an essential component of bronze, so it was always needed. Again, the merchants were able to mark up the price and make a big profit by selling the tin in Anatolia. Fabric was transported in big rolls, and the tin was formed into ingots. Both were loaded up onto the backs of black donkeys for the long overland journey. Sometimes, the merchant who was preparing to make the trip to Anatolia had borrowed money from a relative in order to buy the textiles and the tin, along with the donkeys he needed for his trading mission. That relative expected to be paid back and didn't expect to have to ask for the payment. There are a number of letters that survive in which the family member was put into the awkward position of calling out his brother or cousin for not paying his debts. This was considered to be rather rude, but sometimes it was necessary. So the donkeys were loaded with their goods, and it was time to go. A caravan set off for Anatolia, taking 2 or 3 months to reach its destination, more than 800 miles away. This wasn't an easy journey. The merchants would pass along the northern reaches of the Mesopotamian river valleys, and then up through a pass in the Taurus Mountains, and on to the Anatolian plateau. Sometimes they would be robbed along the way. Sometimes they seemed to have tried to avoid paying taxes at checkpoints. Smuggling could land the men in prison, but they don't seem to have remained incarcerated for long, and in any event, they kept writing letters from prison, continuing to manage their businesses. When the merchants reached the city of Kanesh in Anatolia, they went first to the palace of the king, so that he could pick out the textiles that he would take as his tax. Then they were free to join their family members in the karam, the trading quarter, and to begin to sell the rest of the shipment. Representatives of all the major trading families seem to have lived year-round in the houses in the karam at Kanesh. Presumably, the visiting traders stayed in their relatives' houses. We can guess that this is true because letters found in the houses were often addressed to several different adult members of a family. Letters from home took almost as long to reach Anatolia as the caravans took to get there, so it wasn't possible to communicate quickly. One fascinating thing about the houses of the Anatolian merchants is that the design is exactly the same as what you see in the houses of the local Anatolian people at this time. Even the pottery found in the houses is the same. The archaeologists who excavated the site said that if it weren't for the cuneiform tablets, they wouldn't have had any idea that this neighborhood was home to a colony of expatriate Assyrians. So the Assyrians hadn't come to impose their culture. They were just long-term visitors. But some of them did marry Anatolian wives. Most Assyrian men had just one wife, but a trader living away from home was allowed to have 2 wives, one in each city, so long as the families were kept separate. The women of the merchant families were often very involved in trade. They didn't just do some of the weaving, they also helped run the business when their husbands were away. Not all the merchants stayed in Kanesh once they had arrived. Some of them went on to other towns and cities in Anatolia, selling their textiles and tin wherever they went. The silver that they were paid weighed very little, even though it was so valuable. They didn't need donkeys to ship the silver back home, so they sold the donkeys as well. The return journey to Ashur must have been faster and easier than the journey to get there. The silver acquired in Anatolia was then put to use in paying for business expenses and in buying a whole new shipment of goods to send back. And so this trading cycle continued over and over for more than 100 years. A powerful king named Shamshi-Adad was able to build a short-lived empire in northern Mesopotamia and Syria during the 18th century BCE, after the Near East had been in turmoil for some time. 7 or 8 major kingdoms had been fighting one another, battling over borders, maneuvering to gain alliances, and stealing one another's vassals. Early in his reign, his land of Akkadians had been conquered by a neighboring kingdom, forcing Shamshi-Adad to flee to exile in Babylon. But he was able to recapture Akkadians not long after, and then he kept going, taking over the city of Ashur, which was home to the Assyrian merchants who traded in Anatolia, and then going on to the Habur River and managing to conquer the kingdom of Mari on the Euphrates in Syria. At this point, Shamshi-Adad's empire extended from the Euphrates to the Tigris rivers, just to the south of what is now Turkey. This included some rich agricultural land. The northern region of the empire gets enough rainfall for dry farming without irrigation, but the rivers were available to provide irrigation water when needed. Shamshi-Adad had a rather grandiose sense of his own importance. Instead of giving a name to his empire, he took the title King of the Universe. In doing so, he was following in the footsteps of Sargon and the other great Akkadian kings who came before him, even though his empire was considerably smaller. We know quite a lot about him because we have some of his personal letters, most of them written to his 2 sons, as well as his royal inscriptions. Shamshi-Adad's older son was named Ishme-Dargan, and the younger one was Yasma-Adu. They were already adults when Shamshi-Adad had completed his empire, and their father decided to bring them into his administration to help him rule. He would be the great king, but his sons would be kings as well. Each son was set up in a palace in a major city. Ishme-Dargan's palace was in Akkadian, the dynasty's original capital. This was in the Tigris region. Yasma-Adu's palace was in Mari. Shamshi-Adad created a new capital city for himself between the other 2 cities and to the north of them. He called it Shubat-Enlil. All 3 kings in turn had vassal kings who answered to them. This was a new approach to ruling an empire, but it wasn't entirely successful. Yasma-Adu was in a position to help his father with an important ally, the king of Katna, a kingdom to the west near the Mediterranean. Yasma-Adu would marry the king of Katna's daughter. Diplomatic marriages had a long history by this time. It had been more than 600 years since the kings of Ebla had arranged marriages of their daughters to allies and vassals, and similar marriages had taken place ever since. In Yasma'adu's case, we can see the actual stages of the marriage. There's a whole sequence of letters found in his palace at Mari about his marriage to Princess Beltum of Qutna. It seems Yasma'adu didn't have a lot of say in the matter. It was all arranged by his father, Shamshi-Adad, and by Beltum's father, the king of Qutna. The preliminaries went something like this. Shamshi-Adad wrote to Yasma'adu to tell him about the negotiations that had been completed with the princess's father. The princess was going to be given the title of Queen of Mari. This made her the chief wife, who would be present at the major ceremonies with the king. King Yasma'adu also had at least one wife already, so the new bride would be coming in at a higher rank than the current one. Both sides provided vast quantities of silver. Shamshi-Adad paid 4 talents of silver to the king of Qutna for what was called the tehatum, a bridal gift. A talent weighed about 60 pounds, so that's 240 pounds with a present-day market value of about $64,000. But let's compare that to what the bride brought to the marriage and add in some other factors. The king of Qutna gave a dowry to his daughter of 10 talents of silver and garments worth 5 talents of silver. So this princess brought 600 pounds of silver with her as her dowry, with a present-day value of $160,000. This was an enormous amount of wealth, and, like all dowries, it was hers to keep and to pass on to her children. But a manual laborer could hope to earn just 1 shekel of silver per month, 60th of a pound. So Beltum's dowry was the equivalent of 3,000 years of pay for a laborer. In modern times, suppose someone earning minimum wage makes about $1,700 a month. Calculated this way, Beltum's dowry in silver alone would have been worth about $61 million. Next, the princess's father wrote to his new son-in-law, Yasma'adu. It was a friendly letter, telling him that, with this marriage, the 2 royal houses had become one. He said, and I quote, "I am placing in your lap my flesh and future, for this house has become yours, and the house of Mari has now become mine." He also hoped that Yasma'adu would find Princess Beltum attractive. Apparently the groom hadn't met his bride yet. And Beltum's father promised that he'd send anything that Yasma'adu requested. But there was a little bit of a complaint in the letter. Of the groom's father, Shamshi-Adad, he wrote, "Why is it that whatever I desire from the king, he does not give it?" Apparently Shamshi-Adad wasn't very reliable about reciprocating when it came to gifts. He hoped his new son-in-law would be a better diplomatic partner. But soon after Beltum arrived in Mari, things started going badly for her. Apparently her husband Yasma'adu set her up in a house away from the citadel, not in the palace at all. Now Shamshi-Adad, the groom's father, immediately wrote to intervene, reminding his son that this looked very bad, especially given the high status of the queen. Her father might be really angry about this, seeing it as an insult, and he was an important ally. Shamshi-Adad continued, "This is simply not done. There are many chambers in the Palm Palace. A chamber should be prepared for her, and house her there. Do not house her externally." So she did end up being moved into the palace, it seems. But once there, a new crisis developed. Palace officials couldn't stand Beltum's nanny. This was a woman who had taken care of the new bride since childhood, and still waited on her. When Yasma'adu was away from the palace at one point, an official wrote him, calling the nanny unreliable. She apparently didn't understand the practices of the Mari palace. For instance, the official wrote, "During the siesta, when the palace's bolt was set, she had her bring out songstresses to the temple of Ishtar in the midst of a ceremony. This was apparently a major faux pas. Worse, Princess Beltum went out in the sun and suffered sunstroke as a result. Officials sent several more letters to her husband, reassuring him that she'd recover, so perhaps he'd develop some affection for her after all." 2 years into the marriage, Beltum's father wrote to Yasma'adu asking him to bring the princess with him when Yasma'adu visited Qutna with his troops. "Bring my daughter along with you, so that she could conciliate with the gods of her city, and so that I could give her many gifts. She should meet with me so that I could honor her. Presumably the visit happened, and the king of Kutna got the chance to hear directly from his daughter about court life at Mari. No doubt she told him about the initial humiliation of being housed outside the palace, and about her illness, and about the treatment of her nanny. But she probably also gave him valuable information about the politics of Mari. We know this from other letters from princesses who married foreign kings. They weren't just wives and mothers, they also sometimes acted as spies for their fathers. In any event, to go back to the relationship between the great king and his sons. One problem with the co-regency was that Beltam's father-in-law, Shamshi-Adad, tended to micromanage his son's administrations. We can guess that this was true for the elder son Ishme-Dagan in Ekalatum, but we don't have those letters. The letters to Yasma-Adu show that Shamshi-Adad sent messengers to Mari all the time, and that he could be very demanding. He wanted to know why an official hadn't been replaced, or to complain about the servants who had fled the palace, things like that. In fact, all kinds of things upset Shamshi-Adad about his younger son's rule. Mostly, he worried that Yasma-Adu was immature, and that the young king started projects without giving them enough thought. One time, Yasma-Adu decided to commission statues of 6 gods. Each one needed to be manufactured of gold and silver. But that was just the start of the project's ancillary expenses. His father wrote to him to complain. These gods that you plan to make require 1 month of festival sacrifices. Where are the oxen and sheep that you must keep providing for sacrifice at festivals? Here you keep writing to me, saying, I have no sheep or lambs, yet you would still fill the town with gods here, when however many sheep now available hardly suffice for a sacrifice to them. He finished the letter by stating, with no flour and sheep whatsoever, without my permission, you would commission the making of gods of gold. You alone must bear the burden of this project. Shamshi-Adad also accused Yasma-Adu of spending too much time drinking and dancing with servants. It's clear he didn't trust the younger son all that much. He even made sure the particular officials were present when the letters he sent were read aloud to his son. But there's no sign that Yasma-Adu was disloyal to his father. He visited the king often, and asked him for advice. Perhaps he did this too much. Shamshi-Adad wished that he would be more independent and decisive. He wrote, How long shall we govern you? Are you truly a child? Are you not an adult? Is there no beard on your chin? How long will you neglect the administration of your house? Ishme-Dagan, on the other hand, was much more of a chip off the old block. Like his father, the older son was often on campaign. Shamshi-Adad sometimes shamed Yasma-Adu by pointing out that he should be more like his older brother. On one occasion he wrote, Your brother won a victory, but there you lie among women. Now, when you march with the army to Kutna, behave as a man. The brothers wrote to one another as well, and Ishme-Dagan advised Yasma-Adu to consult with him before writing to their father. That's understandable. Perhaps Ishme-Dagan was able to arbitrate between them a little. Throughout pretty much all of Shamshi-Adad's reign, the great king's armies were out campaigning against neighboring kingdoms, and fighting to maintain control of the region he'd already claimed. It wasn't a stable empire, and it wouldn't survive long after Shamshi-Adad died in 1776 BCE. Ishme-Dagan became the great king in his father's place, but he had to immediately organize campaigns against Aleppo in the west and Eshnunna in the east. Although we don't know what happened to Yasma-Adu, we do know that soon after Shamshi-Adad died, the local dynasty took control of Mari again. The new king, Zimri-Lim, took up residence in the palace, though some of Yasma-Adu's letters were left in the archives. Archaeologists found them there, still in Zimri-Lim's archive room, when they excavated the Mari palace centuries later. As it happened, Ishme-Dagan proved to be less brilliant than he'd seemed to his father. He made some clumsy mistakes, including a ham-fisted attempt at diplomacy with the king of Kutna. He asked his younger brother's father-in-law for 2 horses. It was quite normal to ask for gifts. As a king, it was a way of guessing luxury goods that you needed. Then you sent something of equal value in exchange. This wasn't trade exactly, because no receipts or contracts were involved. It wasn't exactly voluntary gift-giving either. Anyway, the king of Qutna sent the 2 horses. In return, Ishme-Dagon sent 20 pounds of tin, apparently thinking this was a fair exchange. But the king of Qutna was furious. The horses were worth vastly more than the tin. So he wrote a devastating letter telling Ishme-Dagon that when you sent me this paltry amount of tin, you had no desire to have honorable discourse with me. The king of Qutna went on and on about the rudeness of Ishme-Dagon and ended by saying, "Why have you done this? This house is your house." He meant they were connected by marriage and alliance. Ishme-Dagon's obligation was to send what the king of Qutna had requested, and certainly to send a gift of equivalent value. Ishme-Dagon's career didn't improve, his kingdom shrank, and he ended up being demoted to a son of the other great kings of the time, rather than continuing as a brother. Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, wrote to Ishme-Dagon, "To those kings that write me as sons, you write as brother." The kings who wrote to Hammurabi as his sons were his vassals. According to Hammurabi, Ishme-Dagon was now a brother of those kings, meaning that he was an equal of the vassals and no longer as powerful as the king of Babylon. The ultimate humiliation was that Zimri-Lim, the king who took over control of Mari, which had been one of Ishme-Dagon's provinces, was now higher up in the pecking order than Ishme-Dagon himself. According to Hammurabi's same instructions, to Zimri-Lim, who writes me as a brother, you write as son. Ishme-Dagon had to refer to himself as the son or inferior of Zimri-Lim. He was incensed by this. He had begun his reign as the master of an empire that included Mari. Now he wrote angrily to Hammurabi stating, "You made me write Zimri-Lim as son. Is that man not my servant? He's not sitting on a throne of his own majesty." The appeal was in vain. Ishme-Dagon was a minor king now. Perhaps his political instincts remained bad, even after that tongue-lashing the king of Qutna had given him. Now let's go back to Mari, where Zimri-Lim took the throne in 1775 BCE and established a new administration. The palace at Mari has been excavated. It's one of the most important excavations in Syria, and one of the most important finds for this whole era. In its time, it was famous for being a particularly spectacular royal residence. Even better, for us at least, the palace had been conquered and burned, and pretty much abandoned after that. So the mud bricks in the walls were baked hard from the fire, and the walls still stood as much as 13 feet tall when the archaeologists found them. I visited the site of Mari some years ago. I found it a very moving experience to stand in the courtyards and rooms of the palace. The French archaeologists who excavated there had installed a roof to protect the ancient walls. At most archaeological sites, you really have to use your imagination to recreate a sense of the ancient place, because dust foundations are left. But at Mari, I was standing right there in the palace, inside the very walls where Zimri-Lim had met with his advisors or welcomed visiting dignitaries. We can get an amazing glimpse of what royal life was like during the Old Babylonian period, not just from the Mari palace, but also from the objects and cuneiform tablets found in it. The palace was vast. It had more than 260 rooms, divided up into sectors. There were workshops, storerooms, private apartments, kitchens, public spaces, offices, archives, a throne room, bathrooms, and even a temple. It would have taken some time to find your way around. The plan was something of a maze, and there were no signs to tell you where to go. No doubt guards were posted to make sure that visitors didn't wander into private rooms. At the heart of the palace was a courtyard planted with palm trees, and beyond it, the throne room where King Zimri-Lim received visitors and messengers. The walls were painted brightly with murals. One showed a procession of sacrificial animals accompanied by high officials. Another showed an investiture scene, in which the king stood in front of the goddess Ishtar to receive the symbols of his authority, a rod and a ring. The scene was surrounded with images of palm trees, birds, fantastic winged animals, and goddesses, all painted in bright colors. The paintings might look a little gaudy for modern taste, but the Mesopotamians loved color. Outside the throne room, just in from the courtyard, stood a beautifully carved stone statue of a goddess holding a water jar. The pipe inside the statue turned it into a fountain so that water could pour out of the jar. Zimri-Lim's throne room was vast, 82 feet long and 40 feet wide. At one end was a throne for the king, and at the other, a platform containing statues of Zimri-Lim's ancestors. Presumably, the room was decorated with rugs and wall hangings, and there would have been a line of clerestory windows along the top of the wall to bring in light. Everything in the palace confirmed the impression that Zimri-Lim was enormously wealthy and powerful. Even the food served to him was elaborate. In the kitchens, archaeologists found molds for shaping bread into edible works of art. Like old-fashioned jello molds, they allowed the bread to take the shapes of fish or deer or goddesses. King Zimri-Lim had bathrooms with clay bathtubs and indoor plumbing for the toilets. But the bathtubs had no drains, and they must have been filled and emptied by hand. In palace workshops, some skilled artisans made gold jewelry. Every fragment of gold was carefully weighed and recorded on clay tablets. Women were hired to spin wool and weave and embroider cloth. Again, the scribes kept track of every ounce of dye and wool that was handed out, who received it, which women were working in teams together, what textiles they produced, and what the quality was. The records of all these workshops were carefully archived. The whole palace must have hummed with activity. In the middle of all this, of course, lived King Zimri-Lim and his family. He ruled there for only 13 years, from 1775 to 1762 BCE. But the 22,000 cuneiform tablets found in his archives make it one of the best-known eras in all of Mesopotamian history. The king was constantly in touch with his officials, governors, and family members. Letters were dictated by the king, written down by scribes, and carried across the kingdom by messengers. Letters that arrived in reply were read aloud to him and then archived. Unfortunately for us, the letters weren't dated, so it can be challenging to reconstruct the order of the events they describe. But the overall impression they give us is that Zimri-Lim was a careful diplomat, a strong commander, a meticulous administrator, and a caring husband and father. Unlike Yasma-Adu, the previous ruler of the Mari region, King Zimri-Lim was away on campaign a lot. The wars of Shamshi-Adad's time hadn't come to an end. When Zimri-Lim was gone, his wife, Queen Shiptu, was in charge of the palace affairs, and she wrote frequently to her husband to let him know anything of importance that took place. Often, she wrote about important messages from the gods. Any prophecy had to be taken into consideration when planning military moves. These messages sometimes came in the form of dreams or visions that people had while in temples. Sometimes the prophets were given a potion to drink that induced visions. In one letter, Shiptu describes a reassuring vision of soldiers who proclaimed the king's legitimacy. She wrote, "Soldiers on the right are shouting to those on the left, 'Given to Zimri-Lim our kingship, scepter, throne, dynasty, and land, both upper and lower.'" And now the vision, also relayed by Queen Shiptu to the king, told him that a rebellion was expected. Sometimes the visions were incredibly specific. Here's one. "There will not be a battle. As it nears, his allies will be scattered. Ishme-Dagon's head will be cut and placed at my lord's feet." This was the same Ishme-Dagon of Ekalatum that we've been talking about. But the men and women who told Shiptu about these visions were wrong. Ishme-Dagon didn't die with his head at her husband's feet. Instead, he died much later in his own bed. Other letters were about the day-to-day running of the palace. Shiptu instructed officials on things that needed to be done and described how she used her cylinder seal to secure storerooms when necessary, she would have rolled the seal on a lump of clay attached to the door. This was a way of locking the room, since the seal had to be broken if anyone entered. Zimri-Lim wrote to the queen as well, asking her in some letters to take care of various administrative needs, and in others to consult prophets or oracles, or to meet him at a different city in the kingdom. It's clear that the queen was not just his wife, but also a highly trusted advisor and surrogate. Zimri-Lim was surrounded by women during his lifetime. He had several wives and at least 11 daughters. No sons are mentioned in the letters. You won't be surprised to hear that many of the daughters were married off to Zimri-Lim's allies and vassals, along with high officials like governors and controllers. He counted on his daughters to be loyal to him and to keep him up to date with news. The messages brought to the court from the Mari princesses are almost Shakespearean in their convoluted politics. One daughter wrote, "If in truths my lord, that Zimri-Lim, loves the city Shuna, her husband's capital, and his servant Ili Ishtar, do hurry here 100 soldiers and your trustworthy officer, and do save your city and servant, else the enemy will seize the city." A couple of the king's daughters were thoroughly unhappy in their marriages, and not at all afraid to tell their father about it. They dictated frank letters to their messengers to be carried to the king. Princess Inebshari, for example, was first married off to a tribal leader who soon died. Then she was married to another of her father's vassals. Her letters are full of the misery of her life because her second husband neglected her and preferred another wife. "My eyes are full of tears and my mouth hungers," she wrote, adding about her spouse, "He has reinforced the guard over me." In a later letter she says, "I am lacking food and firewood, so that events are much worse than before." Over and over again, Zimri-Lim's forlorn daughter tells him to rescue her. "My lord should send his servants to fetch me to my lord, so that I can see my lord's face." Another of Zimri-Lim's daughters, Kiram, was married to a violent and reckless king who threatened to kill her. This husband was also married to another of Zimri-Lim's daughters, whom he much preferred. As Kiram's situation worsened, even her servants were taken away. In one letter to her father, she quoted her husband as saying, "Since I plan to have you killed, he, Zimri-Lim, should come and take you back." Kiram wrote, "If my lord does not fetch me back to Mari, I shall grasp my nose and jump from the roof." It's unclear whether Zimri-Lim ever did manage to rescue her. He certainly tried at least once, but a letter about it says her husband refused to release her. We can only hope that both of the unhappy princesses, Inebshari and Kiram, eventually obtained divorces and returned to the safety of Mari. Among Zimri-Lim's allies was King Hammurabi of Babylon. Hammurabi, you remember, had instructed the demoted Ishme-Dagon to refer to himself as the son of Zimri-Lim, who in turn was a brother or equal of Hammurabi. Zimri-Lim and Hammurabi shared common enemies and sometimes sent troops to support one another. But Hammurabi was becoming more aggressive to his neighbors, and Zimri-Lim began to worry. What were Hammurabi's real motives? Zimri-Lim wrote a letter to Shiptu, asking her to consult with the various prophets and diviners at the palace to find out about Hammurabi's intent for the future. He wrote, "For now, inquire about Hammurabi of Babylon. Will this man die? Will he be honest with us? Will he battle against us?" Shiptu's answer was somewhat reassuring. She said that she'd had a man take a potion, and he'd had a revelation from the gods, which was as follows. "This man, Hammurabi, plots many things against this land, but he will not prevail. You will capture him and stand over him. His days are numbered. He will not live long." Unfortunately for both Shiptu and Zimri-Lim, and for the whole land of Mari, this prediction was just as wrong as the one about Ishme-Dagon had been. Hammurabi didn't die, and Zimri-Lim didn't capture him. Instead, Hammurabi led his troops to Mari and conquered the city. He seems to have robbed the palace thoroughly, sending the jewelry, textiles, statues, and other valuable goods back home. He even had his men go through the palace archives, removing many of the letters that pertained to his own affairs. Then, the palace was set on fire. The wooden roof beams and the door and window frames and the remaining textiles burned readily. The walls of the upper story collapsed, and the great palace was abandoned. It gradually was covered with wind-blown dirt and sand, left untouched until 1933, when some local villagers discovered a statue there. A French team of archaeologists excavated the site for decades, gradually bringing Zimri-Lem and his world back to life. A Mesopotamian king named Lipit-Ishtar claimed in a public inscription that he was called to rule by the gods in order to establish justice in the land, to eliminate cries for justice, to eradicate enmity and armed violence, and to bring well-being to the lands of Sumer and Akkad. The land of Sumer was the southern part of Mesopotamia, and the land of Akkad was at its center. He was referring to the extensive region that he ruled. The year was 1930 BCE. Lipit-Ishtar added that in fulfilling the god's wishes, I liberated the sons and daughters of the lands of Sumer and Akkad, and I restored order. Lipit-Ishtar doesn't mention any military victories. He just laid out what a terrific and peaceful king he was. Everything was about order, justice, and well-being. Only in the curses at the end of the inscription does he evoke an image of conquest. He curses any king who might, in the future, deface or remove his statue. About such a vandal, Lipit-Ishtar wrote, "May the god make his cities into heaps of ruins. May the foundations of his land not be stable. May it have no king." So there was this ideal, in some times and places, that a king would bring order and maintain peace. But most kings in the early Old Babylonian period, from around 2000 to 1600 BCE, also did a lot of fighting. Sometimes this was necessary. For example, if another state tried to take over their border territories, then the king whose lands were being raided had to fight to defend his territory. And there's no denying that some Mesopotamian and Assyrian kings, maybe even most of them, relished going to war. But even Hammurabi of Babylon claimed that by fighting he brought peace. Hammurabi was a king who had built an empire by conquering neighboring lands in the 18th century BCE. He described himself as a ruler who spreads light over the lands of Sumer and Akkad, king who makes the four regions obedient. To the ancient Mesopotamians, the four regions constituted the whole world. Although the Syrian and Mesopotamian kings of the early Old Babylonian era fought with one another, they also negotiated a lot. A neighbor could be conquered in warfare or befriended through diplomacy, as had been true for hundreds of years. And in their daily lives, men and women were much less likely to encounter violence than you might imagine. We tend to have an image of the ancient world as a violent place, but the documents written at the time show that people got along very well within their communities, and they valued civility and generosity. There are almost no references to violence at all within communities, even in the ways that the laws were enforced. The reign of Hammurabi is an interesting time to look at the phenomena of war and diplomacy between states and personal relationships between common people, because so many documents from this era are available to us. Hammurabi used both approaches to his relationships with neighboring lands. He had messengers and diplomats constantly on the move around Mesopotamia, visiting other courts, delivering and receiving letters and gifts, making deals and negotiating treaties. But he also led large armies on military campaigns, and he seems to have had a gift for inspiring people. Hammurabi came to power in Babylon in the usual way, inheriting the throne from his father. At the time, the kingdom wasn't extensive. It was one of several medium-sized states in Mesopotamia and Syria. Like all Mesopotamian kings, he then proclaimed a new name for the year. It would now be called the year Hammurabi became king, Across Babylon, scribes writing contracts and administrative texts now had to use this new name to date their documents. A tablet might be dated to the month of Nisanu, the third day, the year Hammurabi became king. After that, every year of Hammurabi's long reign, all 43 of them had a different name, and each of the year names mentioned some great thing that he had achieved in the previous year. These year names help us to follow the events of his reign, and the events that he thought were important to commemorate. Hammurabi's second year was the one in which he established justice in the land. Now Hammurabi has a reputation as a lawgiver, so you might think this was the year in which he issued his law code, but it wasn't. That didn't come until much later. The act of establishing justice that Hammurabi referred to was different. In Akkadian, the term is mesharim. It's a type of decree that released people from their debts. As you might imagine, this was a popular thing for kings to do. A lot of debts were owed to temples, and interest rates could be crushing, as high as 33% a year. A farmer might have used up his seed grain in a bad year, and needed to borrow more from the temple in order to sow his fields. Now he had to hope that his crops were very successful in order to pay back the loan and the interest. A mesharim decree let him start over again, with the debt no longer hanging over his head. For the next 4 years of Hammurabi's reign, his year names commemorated religious acts and building projects. He restored walls and made thrones for gods, that sort of thing. Then, between years 7 and 11, he became more militaristic, campaigning against neighboring lands. After that, things got very quiet. For the next 18 years, he bragged in his year names that he commissioned statues, dug canals, rebuilt city walls, and had various objects made for the deities, often out of gold. He engaged in no fighting worthy of a year name. His messengers were busy corresponding and negotiating with neighboring lands, and Babylonian merchants were busy with trade. Hammurabi was on the throne for 30 years before events brought a complete change to his reign and to his ambitions. Mesopotamian kings were almost never on the throne for that long. If he'd had a normal Mesopotamian lifespan, he would never have made it into all the history books about world civilizations. But there he was, in his 50s or maybe older, and his kingdom was suddenly under attack by a much more powerful neighbor to the east, the army of the king of Elam, and by a whole mass of Elam's allies. Amazingly, Hammurabi was able to defeat this formidable foe. The name he gave to the year took up lines and lines of writing. Fortunately, scribes had a shorter version that they could use, but the full name of the year listed all the peoples and places he'd been forced to contend with, and that he'd defeated. It went like this. The year Hammurabi, the king, the mighty, the beloved of Marduk, drove away with supreme power of the great gods the army of Elam, who had gathered from the border of Marhashi, Subartu, Gutium, Tubliash, and Malgium, who had come up in multitudes, and having defeated them in one campaign, he secured the foundations of Sumer and Akkad. Did you notice in there how it was only with the power of the great gods that this victory was possible? I'm sure Hammurabi believed that. His victory was evidence that the gods were on his side. This might have given him confidence to go on the offensive against an old rival, Larsa, a kingdom just to the south of Babylon. Hammurabi's subsequent victory in Larsa gave him even more momentum. He started going on annual campaigns to overthrow one former ally after another, including Zimrilim of Mari. In just 9 years, he built an empire that extended from the Persian Gulf north to Mari, encompassing pretty much all of what is now Iraq and part of eastern Syria. It was the biggest empire since the time of Sargon of Akkad in the 23rd century BCE. Hammurabi lived for several more years after conquering his empire. Ultimately, he ruled for 43 years, having taken Babylon from its status as one of several kingdoms to an empire that had conquered many of them. In spite of his military conquests, he still cast himself in the mold of earlier kings like Ur-Nama or Gudea. He portrayed himself as a pious shepherd of his people who brought peace and justice, not as an oppressor who tore down their walls. Towards the end of his reign, he proclaimed the laws for which he's so famous. He had them carved on several stone steles and set them up in a number of places across his empire. They give us insights into daily life in Hammurabi's time. So do a lot of other documents from this era. Many of these documents were found in private houses. We're lucky that people had taken to sending letters to one another and keeping contracts about their private business transactions, so we can get a much more vivid and three-dimensional view of how most people lived than was true of the eras before Hammurabi's time. Although different social classes existed in ancient Mesopotamia, it can be hard to figure out the class of a particular individual. The classes mentioned in the texts are Awilim, Mushkenim, and Wardum, with the Awilim being the highest and the Wardum the lowest. Wardum is usually translated as slave, but Mesopotamian slavery was different from slavery in other lands. Unlike in Rome, the slaves were not put to work on large agricultural estates. They could be bought and sold, and were often enslaved as prisoners of war. Slaves had a distinctive hairstyle. If a barber shaved off a slave's hair, that slave could pass for a free person. So, as you might guess, there was a severe penalty if the barber did this. The difference between a higher-ranking Awilim and a lower-ranking Mushkenim is harder to figure out. Mushkenim is often translated as commoner, but that makes it sound as though Awilims were rich. Sometimes they weren't. The difference might be that an Awilim owned property, even a small house or field, while a Mushkenim was a renter, a tenant farmer, or a hired laborer. In any event, the class system wasn't very rigid. There were no rules against intermarriage, for example. And the laws suggest that society and the courts might have been generous to the poorer people. A physician was expected to charge patients on a sliding scale, charging less to a Mushkenim than to an Awilim. A fine owed by a Mushkenim was often less than a fine owed by an Awilim. He could afford less after all. One thing that shines through all the private documents, the importance of families. Throughout the lives of Mesopotamians, their families were their first priorities. Within a family, children grew up with routines. In farming families, which constituted the vast majority, boys worked alongside their parents from an early age, sowing seeds, weeding, harvesting, and tending domestic animals. Year after year, the seasons and the river determined the agricultural calendar. Each day, girls helped their mothers grind flour, bake bread, spin wool, weave cloth, and take care of their siblings. These children learned early on what was and what was not permitted within the household, and by extension, in society. Some life stages that seem inevitable to us had no place in their culture. We see no evidence of rebellious teenagers in ancient Mesopotamia, for example. In a world that emphasized the importance of family and respect for hierarchy, it probably didn't occur to a teenager to defy his or her parents. By the time a girl reached adolescence, arrangements would have begun for her marriage. Boys grew up knowing that they would eventually become the heads of households of their own. They emulated the men in their families and began learning a trade or profession, usually the same one as their father, as soon as they could. A young couple hoped for plenty of children. Many babies and children died of illness. Those who survived were crucial to the economy of a family. Couples who were unable to have biological children were quick to adopt. And in the adoption contracts that were drawn up, the parents swore that their adopted son had the same rights that a biological son would have had, the same rights that biological children would have if they came along. When and if parents reached old age, their grown children were expected to support them. Even after death, children were important. They continued to provide gifts and prayers at the parents' tomb. According to one story, the more children you had, the better off you were in the afterlife. Families were close, but not all relatives lived in the same house. In a couple's immediate household were their children, unmarried sisters, and perhaps the husband's parents if they were still alive. Plenty of other relatives were usually close by. A man's brothers, with whom he shared a common inheritance, might spend their days working in adjoining fields, and often they lived in adjoining houses. Unlike in some other ancient cultures, women didn't lose touch with their parents and siblings after they married. Even if they moved away from their hometown, women still were expected to send letters and gifts. If a woman and her husband were having a hard time financially, they could expect their siblings to help them out. The families provided a safety net. In some archives found in Mesopotamian houses from the Old Babylonian period, we find that neighborhoods could be occupied by the same few families, generation after generation. Presumably, these families were often joined together by marriage, but women are rarely mentioned, so it's difficult to know. Still, the family archives are fascinating. Most likely, a family archive was originally kept in a pot or a basket in a storage room, and it could include various documents to be saved for the future. These could be personal letters, name lists, or school exercises, but mostly they were made up of contracts, maybe a will or a marriage contract, some contracts from when servants were hired or slaves were bought, a canceled loan contract, the contract for the purchase of the house, or other contracts for the purchase or lease of fields or orchards. All of these were legally binding, and drawing them up required witnesses who were listed at the end of the document. Usually, each person was identified by his profession or by the name of his father. Some of the witnesses and the parties to a contract also often sealed the tablet or its clay envelope, rolling their cylinder seals on the edge. These witness lists are full of brothers and neighbors of the main parties to the contracts. Sometimes sons are listed too. They might have been quite young, but that was good, just in case it was years before someone questioned the legality of the transaction. If that happened, the role of those witnesses who were named on the contract was crucial. The testimony of the witnesses counted the most, even more than the written contract itself. A man trusted his brothers, sons, and neighbors to pay close attention to the contract and to be willing to support him if the matter were contested. It's rare, though, to find a man's father named as a witness. That's probably because few people live to old age. Life for most adults was cut short by forces beyond the control of the Mesopotamians: disease, infection, accident, childbirth, or disaster. Life expectancy was short, even if you survived childhood illnesses. But people could live to old age, even to 90 or 100 years old, in remarkable cases. A man who had the good fortune to live that long was respected and retained his position as head of the household until his death, even after his sons had married and in some cases had brought their wives to live in the family home. The power of the father was limited, though, because of law and custom. He couldn't, for example, decide to disown one of his sons simply because he was annoyed with the boy or because he felt like it. Two of Hammurabi's laws make sure that the son was treated fairly. The first reads as follows: If a man should decide to disinherit his son and declares to the judges, "I will disinherit my son," the judges shall investigate his case, and if the son is not guilty of a grave offense, deserving of the penalty of disinheritance, the father may not disinherit the son. A son, therefore, had an absolute right to a share of his father's property if he behaved himself well. The next law goes further, even excusing the son for a first offense. If he should be guilty of a grave offense deserving of the penalty of disinheritance by his father, they shall pardon him for his first one. If he should commit a grave offense a second time, the father may disinherit his son. In our contemporary society, parents can disinherit their children without having to get the approval of a court, but things were different in Mesopotamia. This might have been because someone's inheritance from their parents was a major source of their income for life. It would be cruel to deny this to an heir for no reason. Men and women alike owned property, and a woman's property remained her own even after she got married. When either parent died, their wealth was divided up as equally as possible among their children, with the oldest son getting an extra share. Adopted children received the same proportion as biological children. Surprisingly, so did the children of concubines, if their father had acknowledged them as his own. If a daughter married before her parents died, she received her inheritance early as a dowry. For all children, their inheritance was often in the form of fields, a house, farm animals, or furniture. Owning such things made it possible for a young man to marry and support a household. That might have been impossible while his father was still alive. So you can imagine that the division of an estate could get messy and emotional. Sometimes scribes were hired to negotiate among the grown children to make sure the inheritance division was fair. Still, people also often went to court to contest what they'd been awarded. Old Babylonian documents show that the Mesopotamian world was patriarchal through and through. Men were the leaders of almost all institutions, including private households. Women didn't get to choose their husbands, at least not their first husbands. Women were expected to run their households and obey their husbands, but compared with many other ancient cultures, they had surprising freedoms. Not only could women own property and pass it on to their children, they didn't have to wear a veil or to stay in the house. They had active lives outside the home. They could give evidence in court and serve as witnesses, especially if the case involved other women. They could own businesses and work for the palace or the temple as independent employees, quite separate from the men of their families. Women were listed in administrative texts as beer makers, textile weavers, animal keepers, cooks, and wool spinners, among other professions, and they received salaries in their own names. This compensation came in the form of rations of wool, oil, and flour. Priestesses and queens were some of the most powerful people in the land, male or female, and they administered extensive estates and workshops. Women could also dedicate themselves to the service of the gods by taking on a number of religious roles. One group of women, called the Naditus, lived in a female cloister in a temple complex. They could never marry and were considered, in a way, to be married to the god they served. But they could still adopt daughters and inherit land from their parents, and many of them became expert businesswomen and accumulated considerable wealth. There was never any question of whether women were capable or smart. If they were in positions of power, they were assumed to be competent. But how could a woman hold a position of power if she was always pregnant and taking care of babies? Only if a woman was unmarried, like the Naditu women, or a member of the elite with servants to take care of her babies, did she stand any chance of playing a public role in society. On the other hand, a woman could get a divorce under some circumstances, in which case she had a right to her original dowry. And if a woman's first husband died, she could marry again, and she could choose her second husband. Even in arranged marriages, the ideal was that love would develop between the husband and wife. And proverbs, lullabies, and letters attest to the love that parents had for their children. A Mesopotamian proverb probably rang true for many men. It says, "One who does not support a wife, who does not support a son, is a dishonest person who does not support himself. The same idea was confirmed even by the kings. They were dedicated to supporting traditional roles and hierarchies. Lipit Ishtar, the king of Isin, wrote in the prologue to his laws, "I made the father support his children. I made the child support his father. I made the father stand by his children. I made the child stand by his father." Families was so crucial to everyone's life that they provided a model that the Mesopotamians used to envision how the whole world was organized. The gods formed families, with the deity Enlil at the top as the father of the other gods. The Akkadian word for father is Abu, and Mesopotamians used this term to refer to many other authority figures. An expert in any field was known as Abu by his subordinates. The sheikh, someone who oversaw the activities of a town, in much the same way that a father might supervise his wife and children, was a bigger Abu. Even the king, the most distant and powerful leader, styled himself as their father and as Abu of his whole country. When a king conquered a neighboring city, he might allow the conquered ruler to retain his throne, but he had to swear allegiance to his conqueror. The vassal then addressed his overlord as father, and the overlord in turn addressed the vassal as son. Projecting family relationships onto larger and larger arenas, the whole kingdom was brought into a family structure. Expectations of behavior within the family, such as obedience to your parents, extended to all superiors. Fatherhood came to stand in for any hierarchical relationship. The man in the higher position was the father, the lower man was his son. The Akkadian word for brother, Ahu, had another meaning as well, arm or side. That makes sense because the Mesopotamians saw a brother as someone who would reliably be at your side. A father inspired awe and respect, but a brother was an equal, a reliable partner, and a true friend, or at least you hoped that he was. Here, too, the term expanded beyond biological connections could be used about many relationships of friendship and equality. An Ahu could be a colleague, a fellow member of a tribe, or a business partner. Kings referred to their allies as brothers. It wasn't just a formality, they really seemed to have wanted and treasured brotherly ties. If the allied families intermarried, which they usually did, they referred to the fact that they were now of the same house. If you could go back in time and walk the streets of an ancient Mesopotamian city, I think you'd be struck by the friendliness and civility of the place. Families lived right next to one another, their houses sharing common walls. Courtyards at the center of each home provided a refuge from the noise and crowds of the city streets. But no doubt children ran from one house to another, and women chatted while winnowing grain on the rooftops. After the workday was done, men sat at tables or on the ground, playing a popular board game. The game was so popular, it's even been found in tombs, presumably to fill the long hours of being dead. Families must have eaten together and then slept on the roofs of their houses, enjoying the cool night air and staring up at the infinite stars overhead. They might not have had control over disease or natural disasters or crop failures or a host of other scary things, but the Mesopotamians put a premium on self-control, and it seems they shared widespread trust in one another. In fact, a recent study of ancient skeletons shows that there was much less cranial trauma in Mesopotamia during ancient times than in other lands that surrounded it. The researchers concluded that Mesopotamians were less likely to get into disputes with one another that resulted in head injuries. Of course, people didn't follow the societal rules all the time. If they had, it wouldn't have been necessary for the kings to emphasize these rules. But it does seem the Mesopotamians believed that one way in which the naturally chaotic universe could be rendered livable was to behave towards one's family members and neighbors in a way that was respectful and civil, and to support one's relatives. The king, at the very top of the Mesopotamian family, had the same goal for all his people. A big part of his legitimacy was the power he claimed he had to create order out of the naturally chaotic universe, and to provide justice and peace for his subjects. It's hard to imagine society without a legal system, especially a large urban society. Anyone who was wronged would have to seek personal retribution or do nothing and accept what had happened. It would be chaos. Most of us depend on courts, judges, standards of evidence, and accepted penalties to help maintain order. Many people assume that organized justice is a relatively recent development, and yet the first structured and fair legal system was in ancient Mesopotamia. During the reign of King Ur-Ninurta of Isin, in the 19th century BCE, a murder came to the king's attention. A priest named Luinana had been killed in the holy capital city of Nippur. This was no small matter. Luinana was an important man, known to many, a pillar of the community. His wife was named Nindada, and they probably had children. Almost every couple did, whether biological or adopted. Someone had to inform Nindada about the murder of her husband. One would expect her to be horrified and demand justice. But she behaved in an unexpected way. She didn't immediately report her husband's death to the authorities. In the phrase used at the time, she opened not her mouth, covered it up. The murderers were identified almost at once, 3 of them, and they constituted a strange group. One we know only from his name, Nanasig. Another was a slave who belonged to a gardener. The third was a wealthier man, a barber. Barbers were trusted members of society. It must have unnerved many people to hear that this man, who so often had held a sharp razor to their throats, had also killed someone, a priest no less. Did the murderers act alone? And what reason might they have had to kill the priest? Suspicion began to fall on Nindada herself, the priest's wife. Perhaps she had asked the men to kill her husband. Most legal cases in Nippur would have been brought before a panel of judges to weigh the evidence, listen to the witnesses, and render the verdict. But this one was evidently too complex. Instead, it was taken to the king in the city of Isin. Even so, King Ur-Ninurta decided not to hear the case himself. Kings in Mesopotamia served as a one-man supreme court, but they didn't have time to attend to every dispute that came along. So, King Ur-Ninurta referred the case back to the city of Nippur, though not to the judges seated there. Instead, he announced that the trial would be decided by the assembly. The assembly was a group of men who met periodically to help decide important matters. It was made up of men from all walks of life. We don't know where they met. Perhaps it was in an open area near the gate to the city, or in a courtyard of a temple. The accused men, along with the priest's wife, were brought before the crowd. And the men would have known that their situation was hopeless. There was no doubt about their guilt. At Nindada, the victim's widow, stood a chance of being released. After all, no one had heard her ask the murderers to do the deed. It's just her reaction to the news has troubled everyone. So strange. Now, a woman wanting her husband dead was not unheard of. A wife had few options if she was in a bad marriage. According to the laws, for a woman to be allowed to leave her husband, she had to be able to prove to the authorities of her city quarter that she had a perfect reputation and had been unjustly maligned by her husband. The city authorities would send out investigators to ask the couple's neighbors and friends about their behavior. And if her story held up, if she was completely blameless, she'd be allowed to return home to her parents, taking her dowry with her. If her story didn't hold up, she'd have to stay with the man who mistreated her. Some women in this era managed to negotiate prenuptial agreements in which the penalty for seeking a divorce was simply to owe alimony to their husband. But that was a rare situation. Most Mesopotamian marriage contracts, and many survive, offered a different resolution. If a woman wanted a divorce, the The legal phrase she had to utter was, "You are not my husband." But she was more likely to be bound and thrown into the water for saying that than allowed to leave. And if she were tossed in the water, unable to free her hands and swim, she had no chance of surviving. So the men of the assembly might have already been suspicious of Nindada. Perhaps she'd shown signs of being less than fond of her husband, the priest. At the trial, the first men to speak had no sympathy for the murderers or for Nindada. 9 of them took the floor in front of their fellow citizens to speak their minds. These were not rich men, as far as we can tell. One was a bird catcher, another a potter, another one was a gardener. But they had every right to state their case. One of them shouted, "They are men who have killed a man. The 3 men and that woman should be killed." But he had an even better idea. Not only should they be executed, the execution, in a symbolic gesture, should take place in front of the chair of Luinana, the murder priest. Perhaps the priest's chair could stand in for him so that he would, in a way, witness the death of his murderers. Nindada did have her defenders, including a soldier and another gardener, and they presented their case next. They asked, did Nindada in fact kill her husband? What did the woman do that she should be put to death? They had a point. No one had argued that Nindada was present for the murder. If she was not there, was it fair to kill her in punishment? Now, the death penalty for murder was a given, but hiring hitmen, was that the same thing? And could it be proved that she had done so? Presumably, some deliberation followed, and ultimately the assembly reached a decision. The court record notes that the assembly of Nippur took the floor, and one of their leaders announced the ruling. The statement begins this way: "A man's enemy may know that a woman does not value her husband, and may kill her husband." Now, what they meant is that a woman would know of her husband's enemies, and such an enemy could be convinced to kill the husband. The verdict continued. She heard that her husband had been killed, so why did she keep silent about him? This was the deciding factor in their minds. An innocent woman would have immediately reported the murder. Nindada's silence implicated her. So, they concluded, it is she who killed her husband. Her guilt is greater than that of the men who killed him. The court record concludes, in the assembly of Nippur, after the resolution of the case, the 3 men and Nindada were given up to be killed. This court record is unusual in many ways. For one, it pertained to a murder that resulted in the death penalty. Most surviving Mesopotamian court records deal with much more prosaic problems, such as property, ownership, and inheritance disputes. Also, the usual workings of the legal system, judges, witnesses, and oaths, aren't in evidence here. This case was decided by mostly uneducated men and their gut instincts. We have a lot of evidence for how the legal system functioned during the Old Babylonian period, from around 1900 to 1600 BCE. There are many more records of court cases, and several collections of laws, and thousands of legal contracts. Plenty of personal letters also refer to litigation. The Mesopotamians and Assyrians in the Old Babylonian period kept copious records of their legal activities. If someone bought or sold something important, a house or an orchard or a field or a slave, he or she often had a written contract drawn up that listed all the terms of the sale, along with the witnesses who were present. The same was true when a child was adopted, or when a marriage was negotiated, or a servant hired, or a loan made. These contracts, written on clay tablets, were kept in the person's house, and were available to be consulted later if anyone challenged the terms or claimed to have a right to the property. If someone did contest a contract, then the legal system kicked in. And because the Mesopotamians kept so many records, often we get a sense of what happened. Let's look at another court case. This one for something less heinous than murder and much more common. It was an inheritance dispute. In the city of Sippar, southwest of present-day Baghdad, there was an extensive temple complex dedicated to the sun god Shamash, which was home to a group of religious women known as Naditus. The term Naditu is sometimes translated as priestess, sometimes as nun, but neither of these is really accurate. The Naditus prayed to the sun god for the welfare of their families. Often they had been sent to the temple by their parents for just that purpose. One such woman, Amat Shamash, owned a very small house in the temple complex. When she died, the house passed to her adopted daughter. This was typical and uncomplicated. However, Amat Shamash was also survived by two brothers who claimed that her daughter, their niece, had no right to the house. The men went to court. Their claim was that Amat Shamash did not bequeath to you any house whatever and executed no document in your favor. Upon her death, you yourself drew up such a document. In other words, they were asserting that the will was fake. Fortunately for the daughter, whose name is unknown, she had kept her mother's will, which, like all contracts, was written on a clay tablet. In it, her mother had bequeathed the house to her. She also had the names of witnesses who'd been present when the document was drawn up. They were listed on the will and were identified by their names and by their fathers' names or professions. This will might have been many years old by this time, and some of the witnesses might well have died, but some would still be living, and the daughter would have kept the contract right in her mother's house. Witnesses usually included relatives and friends of the parties to the transaction, so some of them would have been easy to find. But perhaps it took several days for the daughter to track down the other men and women who had been there when the contract was written. When she found them, she asked them to come to the trial. The court record tells us that when the day arrived, the trial took place in the Shamash temple complex where the daughter lived. She probably walked a short distance from her home to the proceedings, taking with her the inscribed clay tablet on which the will had been written long before. Her witnesses were in attendance, along with her uncles, and a panel of 5 judges, led by the chief judge of Sippar. After the uncles made the assertion that their niece had fabricated the will, the judges no doubt looked at the cuneiform document. Did it show any signs of having been written just recently? The judges then had 3 holy objects brought into the court from their shrines, 2 symbols of the sun god Shamash and 1 of the goddess Ishara. These would have been made of precious metals, and they substituted for the god and goddess in cases like these. Shamash was the god of justice, and Ishara was the goddess of oaths. Both could be expected to know who was telling the truth. The men and women who had witnessed the contract being drawn up were asked to swear an oath in the presence of these powerful symbols. They had to swear that Amat Shamash, while still alive, had bequeathed the house to the defendant and drawn up the document. The men and women did so willingly. This fact alone was the nail in the coffin of the uncle's case. The Mesopotamians believed the gods would punish anyone who swore a false oath. You could be sure that the gods' punishment would be rendered eventually, and you would live in fear until it happened. At the same time, swearing honestly about something that you had witnessed kept you in the good favor of the gods. Evidently, the uncles had no witnesses to back up their claim. The judges decided in the woman's favor and told the men they couldn't bring the complaint again. This ruling also applied to any other brothers who might have had similar ideas of cheating their niece out of the house. The house now officially belonged to the daughter of Amat Shamash. It's interesting to note what was not mentioned in the court record. There were no lawyers and no jury. Those roles hadn't yet been invented. And no fine appears to have been imposed on the men who brought the case. No one was punished. As was often the case in Mesopotamian court records, the judges decided not in favor of the more powerful party. In this case, that would have been the uncles. Instead, the judges supported the weaker party, the adopted daughter. Their concern seems to have been on the side of truth and justice, not of power or political favor. There's also no reference to the judges consulting the law. The witnesses and the written contract and the presence of the gods were enough to decide the case. In fact, there are almost no references in Old Babylonian court records to the judges consulting written laws. The laws played an ambiguous role in the judicial system. This might be surprising, since the invention of law is one of the many important firsts often credited to Mesopotamia. But written laws were less important at the time than the judges, evidence, courts, contracts, and lawsuits. Hammurabi of Babylon wasn't the first lawgiver, but people often have the impression that he was. The honor is actually held by King Ornama, who ruled several centuries earlier. But Hammurabi's laws are the best known from Mesopotamia. In part, this is because he inscribed the laws on an impressive 7-foot-high polished stone stele, with an eye-catching depiction at the top of himself with the god Shamash. Shamash is seated on the right, handing a rod and a ring to Hammurabi, who stands in front of him, with his hand raised in prayer. The laws cover the rest of the stele. The stele was placed in a public square for all to see. Hammurabi wrote in the inscription that he'd established the laws because the god Marduk told him to, and doing so would bring appropriate behavior and enhance the well-being of the people. The well-being of a well-behaved people, that was his goal. The monument was later stolen by the neighboring Elamites when they sacked Babylonia, and thousands of years later, it was excavated by French archaeologists in the Elamite city of Susa, in modern-day Iran. It ended up in the Louvre Museum. It's still breathtaking. At the time when the historic stele was found, right at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the earliest known collection of laws, and it made the news. Overnight, Hammurabi became an important figure in history. But his laws were also well known in his own land, and not just in his own time, but through the generations. Scribes copied the laws and studied them in a way that had not been true of the laws of Hammurabi's predecessors. Of the approximately 282 preserved laws that Hammurabi proclaimed, many deal with circumstances that can't really be described as crimes at all. They govern such things as the circumstances when a divorce was permitted, how to compensate for property losses resulting from storms or negligence, who could ransom a captured soldier, what to do if an ox gored someone, and what the punishment should be for failing to pollinate a date orchard when hired to do so. It makes sense that these types of things dominated the concerns of average Babylonians, people like farmers, homeowners, and tradespeople. Only 25 of the laws, about 9% of Hammurabi's collection, address violent crimes. Of these, 10 are the often quoted eye for an eye laws that pertain to a man's breaking another man's bone, or striking a man's cheek, or blinding an eye, or knocking out a tooth. Most of these sound like the results of fistfights, and no weapons are mentioned. Interestingly, the accused is always assumed to be a member of the upper class, called an awilam. If one of these men broke the bone of a member of his own class, then his own bone would be broken. This is the so-called lex talionis, the law of retaliation, which is also found in the Bible. But if the aggressor broke the bone of a commoner, that is, a mushkanam, then the upper-class man had to pay a fine. This sounds as though it's unfair. Why did the commoner receive silver instead of having the pleasure of knowing that his assailant's bone had been broken? Well, if you were a commoner, you'd probably want the money to compensate for your broken bone, and you'd want it more than you'd want vengeance. And the amount that a commoner received from his attacker was 60 shekels of silver. Since a laborer earned around 1 shekel a month, this was 5 years' salary. I doubt that most commoners thought this was an unfair deal. Anyway, 6 of Hammurabi's laws address punishments for striking a pregnant woman on causing a miscarriage or the woman's death, probably as a result of domestic violence. One law directly addresses a son striking his father, for which his hand was supposed to be cut off, but we don't know of any case in which this was actually enacted. 5 of the laws punish what we would call rape. though in only one of them is the woman clearly described as the unwilling victim, and in that case she was not to be punished. A rapist, on the other hand, was to be put to death for his crime. The other 4 laws dealt with sexual assaults in a family. A man was punished for having sexual relations with his daughter, mother, or son's fiancé. The woman probably was unwilling in these cases as well, but that isn't specified. 2 other laws address deaths during crimes. In one, a victim was beaten to death while detained by a creditor. In another, someone was killed during the course of a robbery. And finally, one law, just one, concerns premeditated murder when a woman had her husband killed because she was having an affair with another man. That's it. Hammurabi didn't include a law to determine what happened when a man murdered another man, or if a man murdered a woman, or if a woman murdered a man for a reason other than an affair. These scenarios aren't covered. There are tons of gaps like this. The laws don't even try to be comprehensive. They appear instead to be a collection of past legal decisions that the king wished to support. Judges might use them for guidance perhaps, but they don't exactly represent a code of law. Some of the other laws are about lesser crimes, such as robbery or false witness or malpractice. And most really aren't about crimes at all. They determine what should happen when complications arose in everyday life, in marriages, divorces, inheritance distributions, loans, military service, agriculture, trade, and so on. Clearly, people worried about marriage and sex. Many of the laws governed what happened, for example, when someone accused a woman of adultery, or when a man wanted to take a second wife if he'd been unable to have children with his first wife, or when a man had debts before he got married and hadn't paid them off, or when a man broke off his engagement. Hammurabi also included plenty of rules about inheritance, who had the right to inherit and who didn't. The court records tell much the same story. There was a great deal of litigation about property and inheritance and divorce, but not much mention of criminal behavior. Even though I started this lecture with a death penalty case, very few known court cases ended in capital punishment. The judges tended to be much more lenient than the laws might have you expect. And there were no prison sentences, because there was no concept of prison as we know it today. For the most part, if someone could continue to participate in society, he was fined. If he was a danger to society, he was killed. Hammurabi's laws give us intriguing insights into the legal system. Several of them mention the river ordeal. This was a way of determining the truth if there were no witnesses to put under oath, when only the gods would know who was telling the truth. For example, if a man's wife should have a finger pointed against her in accusation involving another male, although she has not been seized lying with another male, she shall submit to the river ordeal for her husband. In theory, what would happen is that the accused woman would be required to jump into the river. If she drowned, then the gods were showing that she was guilty of adultery. If she survived, the gods had saved her because she was innocent. She was not bound in any way, so if she could swim, she stood a good chance of survival. In practice, the mere threat of the river ordeal was often enough to reveal the truth. An innocent person would agree to it readily, knowing she would survive. A guilty person would rather confess than be drowned in the river, the penalty the gods would undoubtedly impose. So the person's reaction to being sent to the river was often enough to prove guilt or innocence. They didn't necessarily have to be subjected to the ordeal. Other laws in Hammurabi's collection deal with the issue of taking an oath. If someone was willing to swear an oath, to give evidence before the god, it was considered proof that the person wasn't lying. No one would be crazy enough to lie in front of the gods. They were so powerful. So, for example, if goods had been stolen from someone and the robber hadn't been caught, the law stated that the man shall establish the extent of his lost property before the god, and the city and the governor in whose territory the robbery was committed shall replace his lost property to him. In other words, if the victim would describe before the gods what had been stolen from him, That was an assurance that he was telling the truth. And the order that the lost property should be replaced was a kind of insurance against theft. The oaths and the river ordeal reflect the deep faith that the Mesopotamian people had in their gods, and they helped the judges determine the truth of a case. The laws were all conditional in structure. None simply stated that one should not do something. That would be an absolute law. They all noted that if someone did a particular thing, then this or that punishment would be imposed. They reflect a basically law-abiding community in which people sometimes gave in to their baser instincts, but in which everything could be worked out. No one had to take the law into his or her own hands, no matter how much he or she had been wronged. Some of the laws might seem harsh to us, but the legal system was considered fair and humane in Hammurabi's time. Thousands of records survive from Hammurabi's era, the Old Babylonian period, reflecting intimate details of people's lives. Reading them, we glimpse human concerns and the successful ways that people used the courts to reach agreeable settlements. It's also striking to note the lack of corruption in the system. As Hammurabi wrote in the epilogue to his laws, "Let any wronged man who has a lawsuit come before the statue of me, the King of Justice, and let him have my inscribed stele read aloud to him. Thus may he hear my precious pronouncements, and let my stele reveal the lawsuit for him. May he examine his case, and may he calm his troubled heart." The laws and the courts in Mesopotamia were designed to reach just decisions, and to allow even the weak in society to obtain justice. It was an effective system that lasted hundreds of years. It also inspired many later legal systems, not just in the Near East, but around the world.